There is a particular kind of monster that history finds most difficult to condemn, the kind that builds cathedrals. In Belgium, King Leopold II was celebrated, adored even. They called him the Builder King, and the title fit like a tailored coat: grand boulevards, soaring basilicas, public parks where ordinary Belgians strolled on Sunday afternoons. He had personally legislated into existence because Leopold, remarkably, had given his workers the right to rest. He championed labor unions. He outlawed child exploitation in Belgian factories. On paper, he was the most enlightened sovereign in Europe. The paper lied. He came from a family already acquainted with catastrophe. His grandfather had fled the guillotines of revolutionary Paris, running for his life, while the French mob rewrote the rules of power in blood. He made it to England. He didn't make it much further, dead within 2 years, an exile to the last. Leopold's mother, Louise of Orléans, was described by those who knew her as sensitive, fragile, constitutionally unsuited for grief. When her father died, she followed him into it. Same year, same darkness. The teenage Leopold was learning early what power could and could not protect you from. Then, 3 years after his mother's death, he found Marie Henriette of Austria, and for a moment, the world seemed to soften. The Belgian people loved her immediately. She was warm where he was cold, generous where he was calculating, alive in ways that Leopold, even then, seemed incapable of being. She was everything he was not, and he married her anyway. By 1855, Leopold had taken his seat in the Belgian Senate, heir apparent, already impatient. He traveled Asia, Africa, not as a tourist, not as a diplomat, but as a man surveying inventory. He spoke openly about colonial expansion when other men still wrapped their appetites in polite language. He did not bother with the language. On December 10th, 1865, his father, King Leopold I, died. 1 week later, his son stood before the Belgian people and took his oath. He was king now, and back home, his record gleamed: worker protections, child labor laws, Sundays off for the laboring class, because the king believed in human dignity. He believed in it, apparently, for everyone except the 10 million people he had not yet decided to destroy. That is the thing about Leopold II that history cannot quite get comfortable with. The contradiction wasn't incidental. It was structural. The unions and the atrocities did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, neatly, in the same man, in the same reign, on the same ledger. The Builder King built magnificent things. He just never mentioned what he tore down to pay for them. Leopold II did not want an empire for Belgium. He wanted one for himself. That distinction, small on the surface, catastrophic in its consequences, is the key that unlocks everything. Other European monarchs of his era cloaked their colonial ambitions in the familiar language of civilization, progress, the so-called burden of the enlightened. Leopold used that language too, fluently, convincingly, but beneath the rhetoric, the architecture of his ambition was nakedly personal. He wanted territory the way other men want property, something to own, something to extract from, something that answered to no one but him. He began, as hungry men often do, by looking for the easiest opening. In the 1860s, his eyes fell on the Philippines. Spain held them then, under Queen Isabella II, and Leopold had made a careful study of Isabella. He decided she was weak, distracted, perhaps persuadable. He believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered, that the right offer at the right moment might pry those islands loose. He dispatched his ambassador to deliver the proposal. The ambassador never delivered it. Whether out of diplomatic instinct or simple self-preservation, the man recognized the offer for what it was, an embarrassment waiting to happen, and quietly buried it. Leopold never got his answer. He moved on, as he always did, recalibrating without remorse. When Isabella lost her crown in 1868, Leopold saw his second chance. The Philippines were suddenly unmoored, politically vulnerable, theoretically available. He made his move again. This time the obstacle wasn't diplomacy, it was arithmetic. He simply couldn't afford it. The price of an archipelago, even a destabilized one, exceeded what a Belgian king could quietly maneuver. So he engineered a workaround. He would help establish the Philippines as an independent state sovereign on paper, unencumbered by Spain, which would then, by the clean logic of private transaction, be purchasable by a private citizen, by him. It didn't work. The plan collapsed under the weight of its own audacity, and Leopold was left with nothing but the lesson: if you want something badly enough, you have to build the mechanism yourself. He filed the lesson away. He would need it. For the better part of a decade, Leopold circled the African continent and the edges of Asia, like a man walking the perimeter of a room he intends to buy. He sent inquiries. He made overtures. He studied maps the way a jeweler studies stones for value, for vulnerability, for what could be taken. Nothing stuck. Africa in the 1870s was being carved up by powers far larger and far more established than a small constitutional monarchy in northwestern Europe. Leopold was not taken seriously. He was, to the great powers of the continent, a minor figure with an outsized appetite and insufficient means. By 1876, he understood that the direct approach would never work. So he invented a different one. That year, Leopold convened what he called the Brussels Geographic Conference, an international gathering of explorers, scientists, and philanthropists assembled, he announced, to coordinate humanitarian efforts in Central Africa, to fight the Arab slave trade, to bring medicine and maps and moral progress to a continent that Europe had decided needed saving. It was an exquisite performance. Out of that conference, he built the International Association of Africa, rebranded shortly after as the International Association of the Congo, a body that presented itself to the world as a scientific and charitable enterprise, multinational in character, benevolent in purpose. It flew a flag of its own, a gold star on a field of blue, hopeful, neutral, the visual language of a humanitarian mission. It was, in reality, a private holding company, Leopold's holding company. The humanitarianism was a costume, and beneath it was nothing but the same cold hunger he'd carried since the Philippines. The genius of it, if genius is a word that can survive contact with what followed, was that it worked. The world looked at the blue flag and the conference proceedings and the careful language of civilization and uplift, and it believed, or chose to believe, which, for Leopold's purposes, amounted to the same thing. He needed a man on the ground. He found one in Henry Morton, Stanley, the Welsh-American explorer, who had already made himself famous by locating David Livingstone in the African interior, a feat that had gripped the public imagination of two continents. Stanley was brilliant, relentless, and morally flexible in precisely the ways the assignment required. Leopold hired him, quietly, and dispatched him to the Congo Basin with instructions to establish a presence, roads, stations, treaties with local chiefs. The treaties deserve particular attention. Stanley negotiated hundreds of them with Congolese chiefs, agreements that, on their surface, established relationships of mutual cooperation and trade. What the chiefs understood themselves to be signing and what those documents actually conveyed were two entirely different things. In exchange for cloth, trinkets, and the handshake of a stranger, chiefs ceded sovereign rights over their land to Leopold's association. Most of them had no concept of what European legal language meant by sovereignty. They were not ignorant, they were deceived, systematically, deliberately, at scale. Leopold collected these treaties the way he had once tried to collect islands. Then came Berlin. In 1884 and 1885, the great powers of Europe gathered in the German capital to negotiate the formal partition of Africa, to draw the lines, settle the disputes, and codify the scramble into something resembling international law. Leopold attended not as a king, but as the sovereign representative of his humanitarian association, the self-appointed steward of a mission to civilize. He lobbied brilliantly, working the room with the patience and precision of a man who had spent decades being underestimated. He secured American recognition first, a crucial early endorsement, and the European powers followed. On February 5th, 1885, the Berlin Conference recognized Leopold II as the sovereign of the Congo Free State, not Belgium, Leopold. The Congo Free State was, in the formal architecture of international law, Leopold's personal property, not a Belgian colony, not a national territory subject to parliamentary oversight, a private estate answering to one man, governed by one man, exploitable by one man, and that man had just been handed a piece of land nearly 80 times the size of the country he was supposed to be ruling. 80 times. The entire enterprise, the conferences, the associations, the blue flags, the humanitarian language, the treaties, the lobbying had been, from the first moment to the last, a single sustained act of acquisition dressed as altruism. Leopold had wanted territory he could own outright, extract from without accountability, and rule without interference. He had wanted it in the Philippines, and they'd slipped away. He had wanted it in Africa for a decade, and the continent had resisted. Now, finally, it was his. To enforce his new sovereignty, Leopold built an army. He called it the Force Publique, a private military drawn largely from Congolese soldiers, commanded by European officers, designed not to protect the population it operated among, but to control it, to compel it, to make it productive in the specific, brutal way that Leopold required. The Congo Free State was open for business, and the world, for a while, looked at the blue flag and believed it meant something good. It did not. It never had. It began, as so many atrocities do, with something ordinary: ivory. The Congo Basin was rich with it, and Leopold moved quickly, extracting and selling with the efficiency of a man who had waited a long time for his opportunity. For a while, it was enough. The money flowed. The operation hummed. But Leopold's ambitions were not the kind that stay satisfied for long, and ivory, profitable as it was, could not keep pace with the scale of what he wanted to build back home in Belgium: the cathedrals, the boulevards, the monuments to himself. He needed more. Then the world handed it to him. In the late 1880s, the global demand for rubber exploded. The industrial age had discovered the tire, the bicycle, the automobile assembling itself, piece by piece, in workshops across Europe and America. Suddenly, rubber was not a curiosity, it was a necessity, and the price of it climbed accordingly. For most men, this was an economic development. For Leopold, sitting atop a territory laced with wild rubber vines, stretching across millions of acres of forest, it was something closer to a revelation. The Congo Free State had rubber in quantities that could make him, if he moved correctly, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. There was only one problem. Harvesting it was brutal work. To extract sap from the wild rubber vines, a worker had to cut deep into the plant, smear the latex across his body to collect it, then peel it off his skin once it dried, taking hair, taking flesh. It required hours. It required stamina. It required, above all, a workforce willing to do it. Leopold's workforce was not willing. This is the moment where the mask came off entirely, not gradually, not reluctantly, but with the cold efficiency of a man who had never really needed the mask to believe in himself. Back in Belgium, Leopold was still signing labor protections into law, still championing the dignity of the working man, still performing enlightenment for a European audience that wanted to believe their king was one of the good ones. In the Congo, he simply stopped pretending. The Berlin Conference had come with obligations, commitments to free trade, to the welfare of the indigenous population, to the humanitarian mission that had, after all, been the stated justification for handing one man a territory the size of Western Europe. Leopold discarded those obligations without ceremony. There was no announcement, no formal reversal. He simply behaved as though they had never existed, because in his private accounting, they never had. What replaced them was a system of forced labor, so methodical, so ruthlessly engineered, that it requires a moment of stillness to fully absorb. Every Congolese village under Leopold's administration was assigned a rubber quota, a fixed amount, to be delivered on a fixed schedule without exception. The quota did not account for the distance men had to travel into the forest. It did not account for the depletion of the vines, which required longer and longer journeys as the nearby plants ran dry. It did not account for illness, or weather, or the basic human limits of a body being worked past endurance. It accounted for nothing except Leopold's balance sheet. To enforce compliance, the Force Publique, his private army, was given authority to do whatever was necessary. And they were given something else, too. A system of incentives that would prove in time to be one of the most grotesque administrative decisions in the history of colonial rule. Soldiers were issued bullets. Each bullet fired had to be accounted for. Waste was not permitted. Ammunition was expensive, and Leopold's operation ran on tight margins of cruelty. To prove that a bullet had not been wasted, had not been used for hunting or personal matters, a soldier was required to return with evidence. The evidence they required was a human hand. Let that settle for a moment. A hand, severed, presented to European post commanders as proof of a kill, as a receipt for a bullet spent. Baskets of them, delivered to administrative stations across the Congo, logged, recorded, filed away in the paperwork of an operation that described itself, in its founding documents, as a humanitarian mission. The severed hand became the currency of the Congo Free State, as real, as functional, as any coin Leopold minted back in Brussels. And then the system devolved further, because systems of sanctioned brutality always do. Soldiers began to understand that hands had value beyond accounting. They could be collected in place of rubber, presented as productivity, used to meet their own unofficial quotas. Some men went into the forest not to enforce rubber collection, but simply to harvest hands, cutting them from the living, from the dying, from those who had survived being shot and lay still in the undergrowth, waiting for the soldiers to leave. There is a photograph. It has survived more than a century, and it has lost none of its power to stop a person cold. A Congolese man named Sala sits on a missionary's veranda, staring at the ground before him. On the ground in front of him are the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. She had been killed and mutilated because her village had failed to meet its rubber quota that week. And Sala is not screaming. He is not weeping, at least not visibly. He is simply looking. The photograph captures something beyond grief, a state for which ordinary language has no adequate word. A man sitting with what remains of his child in a world that has just revealed itself to be something he had no framework to have anticipated. That photograph would eventually reach Europe. It would help change the course of history, but not yet. For years, the baskets kept coming. Families of rubber workers were taken hostage, held in cages at force publique stations, starved until their husbands and fathers and brothers returned from the forest with enough sap to purchase their release. Villages that resisted were burned. Men who ran were hunted. Women were used as instruments of coercion in ways that the missionary reports of the era describe, with a restraint that itself speaks to the depth of what they witnessed, as though the full accounting was simply too heavy for a page to hold. Leopold, in Brussels, reviewed his balance sheets. The rubber revenue climbed, the cathedrals rose, the boulevards were laid. The king gave speeches about progress and civilization, and the Belgian press celebrated him, and the international community that had blessed his enterprise in Berlin had not yet found a reason to look too closely at what their blessing had made possible. The Congo Free State was, by every financial measure Leopold applied to it, a success. 10 million people would pay for that success with their lives. Others would pay with their hands. Others still would pay with something harder to name, the particular devastation of a world dismantled so completely that even survival felt like a form of loss. Leopold never visited the Congo. Not once. He ran his operation from Belgium, from his palaces and his gardens, and his carefully constructed public image, at a distance precisely calibrated to keep the reality of what he was doing from ever becoming too vivid, too personal, too difficult to compartmentalize. He was a builder, after all. He built things. What he destroyed, he preferred not to see. There is a point in every system of evil where the original purpose stops mattering, where the mechanism, having been built and set in motion and normalized through repetition, begins to operate on its own logic, no longer in service of the goal that created it, but in service of itself. The cruelty becomes the point. The terror becomes the economy. The evidence of violence becomes, in the most literal sense imaginable, a form of currency. That is what happened in the Congo Free State. The severed hand had begun as proof, a soldier's receipt, a bureaucratic token confirming that a bullet had been used on a human being rather than wasted on something less valuable. But systems of terror are not static. They metastasize. They find new applications. They reward their own expansion. Soldiers began arriving at administrative stations with baskets of hands and no rubber, not because the rubber hadn't been collected, but because hands were easier. Hands required no grueling forest labor, no coaxing of exhausted vines, no hours of extraction in the heat. A raid on a village could produce hands in minutes, and hands, in the ledger of the Congo Free State, had value. So they went out to harvest them. Not rubber, hands. Men who had been conscripted into Leopold's private army, many of them Congolese themselves, coerced into uniform and pointed at their own people, fanned out across the forest with a new kind of quota in mind. The severed hand had evolved from a symbol of enforcement into an end in itself. A grotesque parallel economy running alongside the rubber operation, fed by the same violence, answering to the same administrative structure, logged in the same station records that Leopold's accountants reviewed from Brussels. The Congo Free State was generating two kinds of wealth simultaneously. One went into Leopold's coffers. The other accumulated in baskets at the feet of European commanders who had stopped asking questions about where the hands came from. The missionaries saw it first. They moved through the interior in ways that Leopold's administrators did not, on foot, slowly, into villages that had not been prepared for inspection, among people who had learned, at tremendous cost, to be wary of any European presence. What the missionaries encountered in those villages was not the civilizing mission that had been advertised in Brussels and Berlin. It was its opposite, a landscape of systematic devastation so complete that even men trained to bear witness struggled to find language adequate to what they saw. The English missionary John Harris traveled to the village of Insongomboyo and returned to write a report that became, in its restraint, one of the most damning documents of the era. He had just returned from the journey inland, he wrote. The abject misery and utter abandonment were, in his words, positively indescribable. Indescribable. A missionary, a man whose entire vocation was built around the power of language to reach the unreachable, to make the invisible visible, arriving at the edge of what words could hold and stopping there. That stop is itself a testimony. What Harris had seen was not an incident. It was not an excess, not a local commander gone rogue, not an aberration in an otherwise functioning system. It was the system, operating exactly as designed, producing exactly the results it had been engineered to produce. He wrote his report. He sent it home. Leopold, in Brussels, read his balance sheets. The protests were growing, but slowly, cautiously, in the careful, qualified language of men who understood that Leopold had friends in high places and lawyers who knew how to make inconvenient truths expensive. Human rights as a global organizing concept was still in its infancy. The mechanisms that might, in a later century, have compelled accountability did not yet exist in any meaningful form. Leopold understood this. He had built his operation in the window between the scramble for Africa and the moment when the world might develop the moral infrastructure to push back against it. He was not lucky, he was strategic. The impunity was not accidental. It had been engineered, the same way everything else had been engineered, by a man who thought in decades and understood that distance, both physical and diplomatic, was its own kind of protection. So the protests accumulated, and Leopold absorbed them, and the operation continued. It was the historian Adam Hochschild who would eventually do what Leopold had spent his entire reign trying to prevent, who would look directly at the full scope of what had happened in the Congo Free State and force the numbers into focus. Working from Belgian census records and demographic estimates, Hochschild arrived at a figure that, even now, requires a moment to absorb: 10 million people. In roughly 2 decades of Leopold's personal rule, the population of the Congo Basin declined by approximately 10 million human beings. Half of the people who had been living in that territory when Leopold planted his gold star flag and declared himself their sovereign. 10 million. To put that in terms that a mind can actually hold, that is not a side effect. That is not collateral damage in any meaningful use of the phrase. A death toll that represents half a population accumulated over 20 years of deliberate policy is not an accident that happened alongside a rubber operation. It is the rubber operation, its logical conclusion, the true bottom line of every quota and every basket and every severed hand that passed through every administrative station in the Congo Free State. And the rubber, the direct violence, the force publique, these were only part of it. Leopold's system created the conditions for death in ways that extended far beyond the soldiers and the baskets. When you force an entire population into involuntary labor, you remove them from the fields. Food production collapses. Hunger sets in, not as a dramatic, visible famine, but as a slow, grinding depletion of bodies already pushed past their limits. When you burn villages as punishment for missed quotas, you destroy not just homes, but the social structures that keep communities intact, that care for children and elders, that distribute food and knowledge and continuity. And into this already devastated landscape came disease. Smallpox moved through the Congo Free State with terrifying efficiency, finding in the weakened, displaced, malnourished population a near-perfect host environment. Sleeping sickness followed, spreading through communities that no longer had the resources or the stability to contain it. These were not diseases that arrived from outside and found a healthy population unprepared. They arrived and found a population that Leopold's system had already spent years methodically destroying. The violence and the disease and the starvation were not separate chapters. They were the same chapter, written in the same hand, signed at the bottom with the same name. 10 million people. Leopold never stood trial for any of it. He was never arrested, never formally charged, never made to sit in a room and listen while the scale of what he had authorized was read back to him in the language of accountability. He died in his bed, in his palace, surrounded by the buildings he had commissioned with Congo rubber money, in a country that had, for a time, loved him. History is still working on what to do with that. The missionaries wrote their reports. The census numbers sat in Belgian archives, waiting for someone with the patience and the will to read them honestly. The baskets were emptied and refilled and emptied again, and in Brussels the cathedrals rose, and the king reviewed his finances, and somewhere in the forest, a man who had survived everything looked at his hands and understood, in the specific, irreversible way that survivors understand things, exactly what they were worth to the man who ruled him. Nothing, less than nothing. He understood that too. Power has a remarkable ability to insulate itself from consequence. Leopold had understood this from the beginning, had, in fact, built his entire operation around it. Distance was protection. Paperwork was protection. The blue flag and the humanitarian language and the international legitimacy conferred at Berlin were protection. As long as the Congo Free State remained, in the European imagination, an abstraction, a territory on a map, a line item in a trade report, a civilizing mission proceeding according to plan, Leopold was safe. What he could not fully protect himself against was a writer. Joseph Conrad had not gone to the Congo to change history. He went in 1890 as a steamboat captain, a practical man on a practical assignment, navigating the Congo River through the interior of a territory he understood, before he arrived, only in the way that most Europeans understood it, as a place, as a concept, as the kind of dark, distant elsewhere that empire required you not to think about too carefully. What he found there rearranged something permanent in him. Conrad spent months moving through the Congo Free State, watching, absorbing, carrying the weight of what he witnessed in the specific way that writers carry things, which is to say, he could not put it down and could not look away from it and could not, in the end, find any way to process it except to write it into the world. What emerged was not a journalist's report or a missionary's testimony. It was something that operated at a different register entirely, a novella called Heart of Darkness, published in 1902, that took the machinery of European colonialism and held it up to a light so unflattering that comfortable people on two continents found themselves suddenly, unwillingly, implicated. Conrad never named Leopold. He never named the Congo Free State directly. He didn't need to. Every reader who picked up that book and followed its narrator into the interior understood, in their bones, exactly where they were and exactly whose operation they were witnessing. The horror that the story's most famous line gestures toward was not a literary abstraction. It had a return address. The book spread. It was read in drawing rooms and universities and parliamentary offices. It was discussed in the places where opinion was formed and policy was made. And for the first time, the comfortable distance that Leopold had so carefully engineered between himself and his operation began to close. Leopold responded the way powerful men respond when the truth begins to move faster than they can manage it. He hired someone to tell a different story. Mary French Sheldon was, by 1902, a well-regarded American author and explorer, a woman of genuine accomplishment who had traveled Africa before and written about it with authority. Leopold approached her with a proposition that was, in its architecture, a masterpiece of managed perception. He would fund her journey to the Congo Free State. He would arrange her itinerary. He would ensure she had access, comfort, and the full cooperative assistance of his administrative apparatus. In exchange, she would see what he wanted her to see. The stations that had been cleaned up, the villages that had been coached, the administrators who had been instructed for the duration of her visit to behave like men running a humanitarian mission rather than men running an extraction operation enforced by systematic mutilation. Leopold had spent years building a machine designed to produce rubber and suppress dissent. Redirecting a portion of that machine toward the production of favorable testimony was, for him, a minor operational adjustment. Sheldon toured the Congo Free State and returned to England with her conclusions intact, or rather, with Leopold's conclusions wearing her name. She wrote that she had witnessed more atrocities in the streets of London than she had ever seen in the Congo. It was a line perfectly calibrated to infuriate the people it was meant to discredit, and for a moment it worked. Her credibility lent the statement a weight that Leopold's own denials could never have carried. She was not a king protecting his investment. She was an independent observer reporting her findings. Except she wasn't. She was a guided tour. History has not been kind to that chapter of her legacy, and it shouldn't be. Whatever her private doubts, and some accounts suggest she had them, she delivered what Leopold paid for. She handed a monster a shield, and he used it, for a while, to keep the reckoning at bay. But the reckoning was no longer a matter of if. The Congo Reform Association, led by the journalist E.D. Morel and the diplomat Roger Casement, had been building a case against Leopold with the methodical patience of people who understood that sentiment alone would not be enough. Casement's 1,904 consular report to the British government, compiled from first-hand testimony, from missionary accounts, from the evidence of men and women who had survived the force. Publique was a document so specific, so precise, so resistant to the kind of vague dismissal that Leopold had successfully deployed against earlier critics, that it could not be absorbed and forgotten. It named names. It described wounds. It recorded testimony in the voices of people who had been there, who had lost hands and children and entire villages to a system that called itself civilization. The pressure built. In Belgium, the press, which had celebrated its builder king for decades, began to turn. Parliament, which had largely deferred to Leopold's management of his personal territory, began to ask questions it had previously found convenient not to ask. The international community that had blessed the Congo Free State in Berlin began, quietly, to reconsider what exactly it had blessed. Leopold fought it the entire way. He commissioned reports, he funded counter-campaigns, he leveraged his remaining diplomatic relationships and spent what was necessary to slow the momentum of accountability. He was not a man who conceded anything without extracting the maximum possible cost from the concession. But by 1908, even he understood that the Congo Free State was finished, and so he sold it to Belgium, to the people whose name he had used, whose international standing he had leveraged, whose government he had maneuvered for decades in service of a private empire they had never truly been allowed to see. He sold them the territory he had personally owned and personally bled for 20 years, and he did it on his terms. The final price was 215 million francs. 50 million of that went directly to Leopold, personally. A private payment to a private sovereign for the surrender of a private estate, an estate that had been built on forced labor, maintained through systematic mutilation, and operated at the cost of 10 million lives. 50 million francs, deposited into the accounts of a man who had never spent a single day in the territory he was being paid to relinquish. Another 45 million was allocated for his domestic building projects, the cathedrals, the boulevards, the monuments, the beautiful, enduring, blood-soaked architecture of a reign that would outlast its own exposure. Belgium took the colony, and, with it, the shame which was, perhaps, the most elegant maneuver of Leopold's career. By transferring the Congo Free State to the Belgian state, he distributed the moral weight of what had happened there across an entire nation, diluting his own culpability in the one substance that had always protected him most effectively: complicity. He left the transaction a wealthy man. He left it without having stood in a courtroom, without having answered a formal charge, without having been required to sit across from a single Congolese survivor and account for what his operation had done to their life, their family, their body, their world. The international system that had made him sovereign had no mechanism or no will to unmake him in any meaningful sense. The reckoning came. Let the record show that it came. The book was written, the reports were filed, the testimony was recorded, the parliament finally moved. But the man at the center of it walked away, wealthy, decorated, still resident in his palaces, still surrounded by the buildings he had commissioned with rubber money, still, until nearly the end, capable of receiving applause in a Belgian theater from an audience that had read the reports and chosen, in the particular human way that audiences choose, to separate the builder from the butcher. History does not always deliver the ending that justice requires. Sometimes it just delivers the ending that power can afford. Leopold II could afford a great deal. There is something Leopold II understood about stone that he never bothered to apply to people. Stone endures. Stone is visible. Stone accumulates meaning over time, gathers the moss of civic pride, becomes, if you build enough of it in the right places, indistinguishable from the culture itself. People walk past a basilica every day for 100 years and stop remembering who paid for it. That is not a side effect of monumental architecture. For a certain kind of man, it is the entire point. Leopold was that kind of man. The money from the Congo did not arrive in Belgium as blood. It arrived as francs clean, numerical, convertible into everything that civilization, in the European imagination of the late 19th century, was supposed to look like. Grand boulevards, public parks, a racetrack, a basilica so enormous it took nearly a century to complete, its copper domes visible from miles away, dominating the Brussels skyline the way Leopold had always intended to dominate everything he touched. The Basilica of the Sacred Heart, the Hippodrome de Boitsfort, the Wellington racetrack, the Royal Museum for Central Africa, this last one so perfectly, so grotesquely ironic, that it would be almost funny if you could forget for a single moment what funded it. A museum celebrating the culture and natural history of the Congo, built with the profits of the operation that had just finished destroying the Congo's people. Leopold commissioned it without apparent awareness of the contradiction, or perhaps with complete awareness of it and simply no concern. He was, by then, beyond the reach of irony. Belgium received these gifts and, for a long time, accepted them as gifts. That is how the architecture of impunity works. It does not ask you to approve of what paid for it. It only asks you to use it to walk through the park, to attend the races, to sit in the museum and look at the artifacts and feel, however briefly, a civic pride that has been very carefully constructed to point in one direction and not the other. But the buildings were only the public half of the transaction. Leopold also spent lavishly, methodically, and without apparent guilt on himself. The royal castle at Laeken, already a substantial royal residence, was expanded under his direction into something approaching the scale of his ambitions. New wings, new gardens, new greenhouses of such elaborate botanical complexity that they required their own staff of specialists to maintain. The grounds became a private world, walled off from the Belgium that Leopold ruled and from the Congo he had consumed, a constructed paradise that bore no visible relationship to either. He purchased private properties. He acquired estates. He built resplendent gardens that would have been, in any other context, the crowning achievement of a man's life, the kind of spaces that invite a certain reverence, a sense that whoever made them must have had, at minimum, a genuine love of beauty. Leopold probably did love beauty. He also loved rubber. The gardens and the rubber were not in conflict for him. They occupied different compartments of the same man, hermetically sealed from each other, never required to meet. That capacity for compartmentalization, for building one world while dismantling another, for cultivating roses in Brussels while the Force Publique worked in the forest, was not incidental to who Leopold was. It was his defining characteristic. Then came the moment that, more than any other, strips away whatever remained of ambiguity about the man. When the Belgian Parliament finally forced the sale of the Congo Free State in 1908, when the operation was officially, legally over, when the ledger was being closed and the transfer of sovereignty was underway, Leopold did not reflect. He did not confess. He did not, in any register, public or private, acknowledge what the previous 2 decades had actually been. He destroyed the evidence. He burned the archives of the Congo Free State, the administrative records, the station logs, the documentation of the quota system and the Force Publique, and the baskets of hands and the decades of extracted rubber and extracted lives. He fed it to fire with the focused intentionality of a man who understood exactly what those documents contained and exactly what they would mean in the hands of anyone inclined to use them honestly. He reportedly told an aide, in a line that has survived him and will likely outlast his buildings, "They have no right to know what I did there." Sit with that sentence for a moment. Not, "I am not responsible." Not, "The accounts are exaggerated." Not even the coward's refuge of, "It was a different time." They have no right to know. It is the statement of a man who understood precisely what he had done, who had no illusions about the Congo Free State that he had not deliberately constructed himself, and who had decided, with the same cold strategic clarity that had driven every decision of his reign, that knowledge was the only remaining threat, and that fire was the appropriate response to it. The records burned. The buildings stood. That is the final equation of Leopold's reign, and it is worth holding clearly in mind because it has not resolved itself with time, it has only become more visible. The Basilica of the Sacred Heart is still there, still dominating the Brussels skyline, still receiving visitors who may or may not know what funded its construction. The Royal Museum for Central Africa is still there, though it underwent a significant renovation in recent years, a belated reckoning with its own origins that Leopold could not have anticipated and would certainly not have approved. The gardens at Laeken are still royal property. The castle still stands. The archives are ash. And somewhere in that asymmetry, the stone that endures and the paper that was made to disappear is the truest portrait of Leopold II that history has managed to produce. A man who built for permanence and burned for protection, who understood that civilization, in the end, is largely a competition between what gets preserved and what gets destroyed, and who made very deliberate choices about which was which. He was not deluded. He was not a man who had convinced himself that the Congo Free State was a humanitarian mission gone wrong, an idealistic project undone by difficult circumstances. He knew. The burning tells us he knew. The sentence tells us he knew. They have no right to know what I did there. He built the basilica anyway. He planted the gardens anyway. He accepted the applause in the theatre and the expressions of solidarity from foreign dignitaries and the civic gratitude of a Belgian public that was walking through his parks and attending his racetracks while, in the same years, the missionary reports were accumulating and the census numbers were sitting in the archives he had not yet gotten around to burning. He built himself a legacy designed to outlast the reckoning, and in certain important respects, it has. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It is not meant to be. The buildings are beautiful. The basilica is genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful, in the way that things built without regard for cost so often are. The cost, in this case, was 10 million lives. Walk through the park. Look at the domes. Try to hold both things at once. That is what Leopold counted on you being unable to do. There is a particular cruelty in watching a man who inflicted boundless suffering upon the world receive, in return, only the ordinary griefs. Leopold II lost a son. His only son, Prince Leopold, 9 years old, fell into a pond on the royal grounds and contracted pneumonia. The illness moved quickly, the way illness moves through children, without negotiation, without regard for the name the child carried or the throne he was meant to inherit. The boy died. And the king, who had never demonstrated any particular capacity for feeling the losses of others, discovered that he was not exempt from the specific devastation of losing a child. History does not require us to withhold that grief from him. It only requires us to hold it next to the other number, the 10 million, and to note, without editorializing, the distance between the grief Leopold was permitted to feel publicly and perform for a sympathetic world, and the grief he spent 2 decades making systematically invisible in the Congo. He mourned his son. He did not mourn theirs. The marriage to Marie Henriette had never been what either of them had hoped for, though the nature of the disappointment ran in different directions depending on which of them you were. For Henriette, it had been a life lived alongside a man constitutionally incapable of warmth, married to his ambitions in ways that left room for a wife only as a function, a producer of heirs, a presence at ceremonial occasions, a name beside his in the dynastic ledger. She was, by most accounts, genuinely beloved by the Belgian people, vivid, generous, alive in public in all the ways Leopold was not. The contrast between them was visible enough that observers noted it without embarrassment, and Henriette was smart enough to understand exactly what that contrast said about her marriage. They had produced 4 children together, 3 daughters, and finally, the son that Leopold had required. When that son died at 9 years old, something in the architecture of the marriage that had never been particularly sound gave way entirely. Leopold tried. In the cold, procedural way that he tried things, he attempted to produce another male heir as though the problem were logistical, as though grief were a setback to be managed rather than a thing that happened to people. Another daughter arrived. Not the son he needed, not the continuation of the line that would justify everything, that would give the dynasty a future worthy of the empire he had built. He could not control this. That may, in its way, have been the most disorienting discovery of his life, that the same will and strategic intelligence that had pried a territory 80 times the size of Belgium from the hands of an entire continent could not produce a male child, that there were forces entirely indifferent to what Leopold II wanted. By 1902, the same year, Conrad's novella was moving through European drawing rooms. The same year, the international pressure on the Congo Free State was building toward what would eventually become an unstoppable tide. Leopold and Henriette formally separated. They had been living, by then, in a separation of spirit for years. The formal acknowledgement was almost administrative. Henriette left for a quieter life, the kind of life that women in her position retreated to when the performance of royal marriage became finally, definitively untenable. She did not survive the separation long. Her health, which had been declining, continued its decline, and she died not long after taking with her whatever remained of the version of Leopold that Belgium had chosen to love through her. And then someone tried to kill him. As Henriette's memorial service concluded, and Leopold's carriage moved through the Brussels streets, an Italian anarchist stepped forward and fired 3 shots at the King of Belgium. All 3 missed. Leopold emerged unharmed, shaken perhaps, but physically intact, the same body that had signed the orders and reviewed the balance sheets and authorized the force publique and burned the archives, untouched by the violence it had so comprehensively exported. What happened next is the detail that history should not be allowed to smooth over. Belgium rejoiced. Not the parliament, not the diplomatic corps. The people, the ordinary Belgian men and women who had been walking through Leopold's parks and attending his racetracks and living inside the civic life his Congo money had constructed, came out into the streets in relief. That evening, Leopold attended the theatre. The audience rose. They gave him a raucous, sustained, full-throated round of applause. For surviving, for still being there. This is the thing about Leopold that resists easy narrative resolution, the thing that implicates not just a king, but a culture, not just a man, but the people who chose to see only the buildings and not the blood that mortared them. By 1902, the reports existed. The missionary testimony was circulating. Conrad's book was in the bookshops. The outlines of what had happened in the Congo Free State were available, in broad strokes, to anyone who wanted to look. Belgium looked at its king and applauded. The Pope wrote him a letter of solidarity. Let that stand without embellishment, because it requires none. The Bishop of Rome, the head of an institution that has, in other contexts, positioned itself as the moral conscience of civilization, sent a personal communication to Leopold II, expressing sympathy and support in his moment of vulnerability. Leopold received it. He received the applause, the relief of his subjects, the diplomatic condolences of foreign dignitaries, the continued deference of an international community that had its own reasons for not pressing too hard on what the Congo Free State had actually been. He had lost a son, he had lost a wife, in every sense that mattered. He had watched his reputation on the international stage erode from the heroic humanitarian of 1885 to something that required counter-propaganda campaigns and paid authors to manage. But he was still king, still standing in the theatre while the audience rose for him, still receiving letters from Rome, still resident in his palaces and his gardens, surrounded by the stone evidence of a reign that had been built to outlast the questions being asked about it. There is something almost architectural about Leopold's personal life when you step back far enough to see its full shape. He had engineered everything: the Congo, the humanitarian cover, the international recognition, the building projects, the evidence destruction with the focused intelligence of a man who understood systems and how to make them serve him. And then, in the private rooms behind all that engineered grandeur, the ordinary things undid him, the way ordinary things undo everyone. A child fell into a pond, a marriage hollowed out from the inside. A woman who had been warmer and more beloved than he would ever be slipped away quietly, leaving him the buildings and the applause and the letters from Rome and the precise, unalterable fact that the dynasty he had sacrificed everything to build, including 10 million lives that were not his to sacrifice, had no male heir. The Congo had given him nearly everything he wanted. It had not given him that. And in the particular moral universe that Leopold II had constructed for himself, where everything was tradable, everything had a price, everything could be acquired through sufficient will and strategic patience. The one thing that could not be bought or coerced or engineered into existence was the continuation of his own name. The king who had owned a country could not purchase a son. History, at its most precise, does not traffic in karma. But occasionally, just occasionally, it traffics in something that looks close enough to be worth noting. Leopold II was 65 years old when he found Caroline Lacroix. She was 16. That disparity, nearly half a century between them, the full weight of a king's age and wealth and power arranged against the vulnerability of a teenage girl from the working class, is not a love story. It should not be framed as one, and history has occasionally done it the disservice of framing it as one, drawn in by the spectacle of a monarch undone by passion in the last chapter of his reign. The spectacle is real. The passion may have been real. In whatever way, Leopold was capable of real things. But Caroline Lacroix was 16, and Leopold was the kind of man he had always been. He had never been faithful to Henriette. That much was established early and maintained consistently throughout their marriage. The affairs conducted with the same unsentimental efficiency that Leopold brought to most of his endeavors. They were not scandals, exactly, or rather, they were the kind of scandals that powerful men's infidelities become when the culture has decided, in advance, not to be too troubled by them. Background noise, tolerated, managed. Caroline was different. He met her sometime around 1900, 3 years before Henriette's death, and whatever mechanism existed inside Leopold that allowed him to remain detached from most human experience appears to have failed him completely in her presence. He became, by the accounts of those around him, something that no one in the Belgian court had previously observed in the King of the Belgians. Besotted. He gave her money in quantities that shocked even people accustomed to royal excess. He gave her estates. He gave her jewels and properties, and the material infrastructure of a life so far removed from the working-class existence she had come from that the distance itself became a kind of testament to how thoroughly Leopold intended to possess her. He granted her a title, Baroness Vaughan, a formal elevation that required the king to deploy the same sovereign authority he used to sign legislation and receive foreign dignitaries, now redirected toward inscribing a teenager into the Belgian aristocracy. The Belgian public, which had absorbed the Congo reports with a complicated, compromised silence, found this harder to absorb. The atrocities had been distant, geographical, easier to compartmentalize behind the blue flag and the humanitarian language and the buildings they walked past every day. Caroline Lacroix was here. She was visible. She was 16 years old on a king's arm, and she was being showered with the wealth of a nation while the king's legitimate family watched from what had become, functionally, the outside. The outrage that Leopold's subjects could not quite locate for 10 million Congolese lives, they found with remarkable ease for this. Caroline gave Leopold 2 sons. 2 illegitimate sons, granted honorary titles by a king who had spent years unable to produce a male heir within the bounds of his legitimate marriage, and who had now accomplished in his late 60s what the entire formal architecture of his dynasty had failed to deliver. He recognized them. He elevated them. He directed toward these children, born outside every convention his world officially honored, a tenderness that his legitimate daughters had largely been denied, and that the people of the Congo had never been offered at all. And then the second son was born. The child came into the world with a severely deformed hand. The Belgian newspapers did not approach this with restraint. They called it, in the unsparing language of a press that had finally found a Leopold story it could cover without diplomatic consequence, vengeance from on high, divine retribution. The body of a child bearing, in its very formation, the mark of what his father had authorized in the forests of Central Africa, the baskets, the severed hands, the currency of mutilation that had purchased everything Leopold owned, including the estate in which this child was born. Whether you believe in that kind of cosmic accounting is your own matter. What is not a matter of interpretation is the arithmetic of it, the specific, verifiable fact that a king who had presided over the systematic severing of hands as an instrument of industrial terror produced a son whose hand was formed wrong from the beginning. That the body of his own child bore a deformity in precisely the place where Leopold's operation had done its most iconic damage. History does not usually arrange itself this neatly. When it does, the responsible approach is simply to report it and let it sit to resist the temptation to over-explain it in either direction, to neither dismiss it as coincidence nor inflate it into allegory, but simply to place it in the record where it belongs and allow the reader to feel whatever it produces in them. It produces something. It should. Caroline Lacroix was not a villain in this story. She was a teenage girl from nowhere who entered the orbit of the most powerful man in Belgium and was reshaped by that proximity in ways she could not have fully anticipated and could not have fully refused. What agency she exercised within constraints that Leopold had constructed entirely for his own benefit. She was, in the end, one more person that Leopold acquired. One more thing he decided he wanted and moved to obtain, with the same patient, strategic, absolute conviction that had characterized every acquisition of his reign. The Philippines he couldn't buy, the Congo he maneuvered into existence, the buildings he raised on blood money, the archives he burned, the legacy he spent decades engineering. He wanted her, so he took her. He had never, in 65 years of living, developed a different approach. Even dying, Leopold II was still working the angles. A man like Leopold does not approach death the way ordinary people approach it, with resignation, with reflection, with whatever private accounting a life of consequence eventually demands. He approached it the way he had approached everything else, as a problem to be managed, a final transaction to be structured in his favor before the window closed. He had no legitimate male heir. His legitimate daughters stood to inherit whatever he left behind, and Leopold had spent enough of his reign in conflict with the inconvenient claims of family to understand that inheritance, without careful engineering, had a way of going somewhere you hadn't intended. So he built a container for it. The royal trust was, on its surface, a gesture of civic generosity. Leopold, arranging for his vast holdings, his estates and castles and heritage properties, to pass to Belgium upon his death, rather than dissolving into private hands. The builder king giving back. The newspapers could write it that way. The public could receive it that way. There was, of course, a clause. There is always a clause with Leopold. The clause ensured that his family retained the right to use the properties at their leisure, that the gift to Belgium was, in practical terms, a gift that kept the assets exactly where they had always been, while transferring the costs of maintenance to the state. It was not generosity. It was estate planning, dressed in the language of generosity, which had been Leopold's preferred dialect for the entirety of his public life. The humanitarian mission, the international association, the royal trust. Different documents, same author, same instinct. And then, 5 days before he died, he did one final thing. In secret, not privately, not quietly, but in the specific, deliberate secrecy of a man who understood that what he was doing would not survive public scrutiny, and proceeded anyway. Leopold II married Caroline Lacroix, the woman he had taken at 16, the mother of his illegitimate sons, the teenager he had titled and housed and draped in Congo money, while Belgium watched with the particular scandalized horror of a public that had decided her existence was more offensive than the 10 million deaths that funded her. Jewelry. He married her 5 days before the end, in a ceremony conducted with the urgent, furtive quality of something that knows it is wrong and is racing to become irreversible before anyone can stop it. It did not work. When the marriage came to light, and it came to light immediately, because secrets of that magnitude in royal households have a very short half-life, the Belgian parliament invalidated it. Moved swiftly, decisively, with a clarity of institutional purpose that had been conspicuously absent during the 2 decades when clarity might have saved 10 million lives. For a secret marriage, Parliament found its voice. For the Congo, it had taken considerably longer. Leopold II, King of the Belgians, died on December 17th, 1909. He died in his palace, in his bed, surrounded by the accumulated material evidence of a reign that had been, by the financial measures he applied to everything, an extraordinary success. The buildings stood, the gardens were immaculate. The royal grounds at Laeken were exactly as he had designed them, ordered, beautiful, expensive, and entirely insulated from the world that had paid for them. He died without having been tried, without having been formally charged with anything, without having sat across from a single survivor of the force publique and been required to remain in the room while they spoke. He died as kings die, attended, commemorated, processed through the ceremonial machinery of a state that had every reason to bury its complicated relationship with his legacy along with the man himself. But the money still had somewhere to go. Leopold had bequeathed to Caroline Lacroix a fortune in Congo securities, the financial instruments of the operation itself, the rubber revenue converted into paper, the 10 million lives rendered into yield and interest and transferable value. His daughters from his marriage to Henriette, the legitimate heirs, the women who bore his name and had navigated the cold corridors of his household for the entirety of their lives, challenged the bequest. They lost. Caroline Lacroix walked away with the fortune. The blood-soaked, archive-burned, handbasket fortune of the Congo Free State passed, in the end, to a woman Leopold had acquired at 16 and never quite released, passing through the legal mechanisms of a state that had invalidated her marriage, but could not, apparently, invalidate her inheritance. It was, in its way, perfectly consistent. Leopold had always ensured that the money went where he intended it to go. Even from beyond the threshold, his arrangements held. What did not hold, what has not held, across more than a century of subsequent reckoning, is the edifice of respectability that Leopold spent his entire reign constructing around himself. The buildings are still there, the museum, the basilica, the boulevards. Stone is patient. Stone does not require the story to change in order to keep standing. But the story has changed. The archives he burned have been partially reconstructed from other sources. The census numbers have been examined. The missionary reports have been republished. The name Leopold II now arrives in history classrooms, trailing a weight that no amount of architectural grandeur has managed to displace the specific, documented, unambiguous weight of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who said so himself in a sentence that has outlasted everything he tried to build over it. They have no right to know what I did there. They know. They have known for a long time, and the buildings, however beautiful, however enduring, however carefully designed to be the thing you see first when you look at his reign, the buildings are not the last word. They never were.